Hi everyone, so this is me going over the rubric for the Design an Ecosystem project, which is your Unit 1 and 2 final project. It is worth 100 points, so I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to break it down and what you should be aiming for when you create your project. So this information is all attached to the same document as the instructions, just keep scrolling down. So in case you want to look at this again, it is on there. All right, so I split it up into the three parts. So this first part here is about the ecosystem biodiversity visual, which is worth 50 points. And I'm going to be going over what I think you should be aiming for the exceed standards to get full points. All right, so the first thing I'm going to be looking at is your ecosystem. I'm going to be looking for if it depicts and shows a non-real ecosystem that has both biotic and abiotic factors. I would love for you to have at least 5 of each if you can. And then it also shows the resources that are used by the biodiversity inhabiting there. So this can be shown kind of in your drawing that you do. So whatever resources, food, etc., that your organisms might need should be shown in your drawing. Great. The next part for the biodiversity part of it, I'm going to be looking to see if you have 5 or 6 organisms, and they each should be at a different trophic level, and then they should also have characteristics relevant to their trophic level and environmental adaptation. So what does that mean? It means that whichever organism is a producer, it has to have some way of photosynthesizing or making its own food, right? In terms of adaptations, you might see that the top consumers have specific adaptations that help them hunt some of the other organisms, right? So hopefully when you create your biodiversity, it makes sense still along those same lines there. The other thing that I'm going to be looking for like really great credit is it shows or describes the relative abundance of each organism. So we learned in kind of the energy pyramids that even in terms of number, we have a lot of producers, fewer primary consumers, fewer secondary consumers, and so on, and creates this kind of funky pyramid. So if you can show that in your drawing, that would be super great. Cool. In terms of the food web, I'm going to be looking for if you show the organisms' relationships, you show the movement of the energy with the arrows going in the correct direction. So make sure the arrows are pointing in the correct way, and that your food web is also easy to read, it's easy to follow, and it's like well organized. I would recommend maybe putting the producer down at the bottom and then moving and branching your way up as you work on things. Cool. In terms of the climatogram, I'm going to be looking to see if temperature and precipitation are graphed correctly and neatly. So use a ruler or a straight edge or something like that. I'm going to be, again, checking to make sure you have the correct bars, the correct line graph drawn, the correct axes labeled. So what is the X and the Y axis? Like show and used for. And then you also have some sort of key that tells me like the bars represent this and the line represents this part. It should also be representative of the ecosystem that you drew. So if your climatogram shows a lot of precipitation and yet your ecosystem looks super dry and looks like it does not receive a lot of precipitation, then that might be points off as well. Cool. And then finally, the last thing is just looking at the visual itself. I'm going to be looking to see if it's neat, if it uses colors that show the ecosystem and also that show the adaptations for particular organisms. And then again, this like what you're aiming for is some sort of wow factor, however that may be. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that very open-ended for you all. Cool. The next section is on the Flipgrid presentation. So here, if you are exceeding the standards, you're getting 5 points for each component for a total of 25 points. So I'll go over that. So the first thing I'm going to be listening for in your Flipgrid presentation is you talking about the abiotic and biotic components. So you should explain the difference between what those are. You should list the abiotic and biotic components, and then you should also explain your climatogram and show basically the nuances between living in one's living and non-living. So in your explanations, being able to show how those things are different and how they interact together. Next thing I'm going to be listening for are the adaptations that you talk about. So hopefully you describe the adaptations of each organism and why the adaptations are useful. So the why part is really important, right? Adaptations don't happen because, I don't know, something wills it to, or it happens randomly. This is, why we don't have random colors on us, but we are a particular color. So tell us why the adaptations are useful for that organism to survive in your particular ecosystem. Great. Cool. The next thing I'm going to be listening for are generalists versus specialists. So this describes what organisms are generalists and specialists and why they're considered those things. So giving a little bit of a definition and maybe explaining like, oh, this organism is a specialist because it only eats this particular thing, or this organism is a generalist because, as you can see on my diagram, it can live in all different parts of this ecosystem. So however you'd like to explain it is up to you, but please make sure you include the reasons why. Next thing I'll be listening for is you discussing the trophic levels. So you should be able to, as you're showing your ecosystem, explain the trophic levels, identify them correctly, especially if there are some organisms that are in multiple trophic levels. And then you should be able to explain how the energy passes through your trophic levels. If you can talk about like how much energy passes through the trophic levels, like we talked about with the 10% rule. Cool. And then finally, the last thing I'll be looking for in your Flipgrid presentation is just looking at the food web in general. You should be able to, again, accurately explain how the energy flows through your food web. You should talk about how a food web represents the predator-prey interactions. You can also talk about competition. Maybe two organisms eat the same thing. You could explain a little bit about their competition on there. Great. And then finally, we have the EIR worth 25 points. And again, I'm going to go over this, what you should be aiming for, 5 points each. The first thing I'm going to be looking at is your disturbance itself. So I'm going to be looking to see if you gave me a detailed description of the disturbance and also how that connects to your ecosystem's location, climate, or history. So what I mean by that is like, if you say created an ecosystem that is really wet and rainy and your climatogram shows that, you probably don't want to list something like a fire as your disturbance because it doesn't make sense in the context of your ecosystem. However, if you have a super dry ecosystem, that might be a cause for that, right? So make sure it makes sense within your ecosystem. And then you should also tell me whether the disturbance is completely random, whether it is naturally occurring, or if it's human-made. Cool. And then these next two are pretty much the same, the effect on abiotic and the effect on the biotic factors. So make sure you explain the effect of your disturbance on the non-living parts and the living parts of your ecosystem separately, and then talk about how those effects continue either short-term or long-term and what that means for the ecosystem. Here would be a good time to talk about extinctions or succession or things like that. Cool. Next up, I'm going to be looking at your mitigation idea. So you should create a realistic mitigation idea and explain how that would help kind of affect the current circumstances of the disturbance or potentially prevent similar disturbances in the future. And then finally, just a quick 5 points for spelling, punctuation, capitalization, sentence structure. I'm not going to be super picky. This does not need to be in scientific academic language, but it should be fairly free of errors so that I can understand it. All right, great. So I know that was a lot. It is a big project, but I'm super excited. I hope you are too. I've already heard some really great ideas from a lot of folks. So take those ideas, run with them, and just make sure you include all of this information because that part is equally as important as the creative side. Cool. Good luck.